Broken Thing, Chapter 18. He had to keep her under venom and bound as much as he could. There was no choice in the matter. Hours and hours he had spent thinking and choosing the potential paths and alternates he could find to freedom and license. He was under the cripplingly heavy yoke of preoccupation with the Leviathan's sporadic communication that could take him at any time, navigating the Reaper while being unable to navigate her. All of his named things in her mind were gone, the delicate framework of constructed identity, prohibition, and control stripped off her. If he were to take her word for it, she remembered everything. Whether or not she was right, he had no time to verify. He did not have the time to search each of her memories for what might have remained of his influence. He still had the ability to make her nameless, under venom, because she was a deep thing, a thing unreachable, unaffected by words, an irrevocable symbol. How to grant her access to her names without granting her access to her, he did not yet know. He could not ask the Leviathan to help. That would be admitting to weakness, to lack of control. His authority was predicated upon his ability to control her. He had promised to report every 4 hours, and that would be problematic. Necessary, so the Normandy did not overreact and attempt the rescue of their incapacitated commander. She must not be incapacitated for long. He had reported that she was sleeping, spoken to Dr. Chakwas regarding decompression sickness and the measures he took, but she must begin soon in her role as Shepard, at least for the Normandy's sake. She need not retain those memories. He could convince her of her personal timeline. The Reaper was her triumph and must remain so. The Leviathan must remain mysterious. He did not believe that the Leviathan would speak to her or to those on the Normandy, but he must make himself available to them at every opportunity to avoid them considering that path. Priority 1. Maintain contact with Leviathan. Learn the potentials of Reaper capability. Risks. My mind. My life. My will. Gains. Being the exclusive conduit to their knowledge and plans, the ability to control Reapers. Priority 2. Maintain contact with the Normandy every 4 hours in organic and realistic status as Shepard would present herself. Cannot be deferred. Timestamps on his Omnitool would create a potential discrepancy, questions as to why a spontaneous report was recorded and released later. Secondary aim. Construct an organic timeline for Cara herself. Stage the discovery of the Reaper when she is fully Shepard. Risks. She could activate any number of unknown distress codes. Determine codes. When she is fully Shepard, she is likely to kill me unless I am fully Rin. Gains. Time to execute Priority 1. Priority 3. Knowing Leviathan true or projected purposes, determine where to cooperate and where to deviate, how to influence if possible. Construct a translated alternate explanation for taken actions and motivations to relate to her and through her to the Normandy and the Council. Create her names. A superior framework than that created on Beckenstein. Explore Reaper capability to assist in same. Risks. Insufficient time to achieve goal given her resistance to suggestion and coercion. Her ability to learn. My tendency to become lost in her body, in her mind, unwilling or unable to touch her without precious time disappearing due to my lack of control where she is concerned. Gains. Her. Compartmented as a home, rooms of her I can visit one by one, if not all of her whole. Priority 4. Maintain physical body. Rest. Risks. She is likely to kill me. Gains. Continued life. His immediate priority was to set up a staging area, Whatever controls there were to a Reaper, she would have no real access, only simulated access. He docked and carried her, bound and envenomed to the equivalent of a mess hall for drones. It was an expansive space once cleared. Fortunately, the process of creation or removal of objects was intuitive and near immediate with the help of the Leviathan who assisted him in assimilation of control. After a blindingly painful insertion of direct information that brought him to his knees and made his nose bleed, he was able to interface. He created a command chair, a useless set of controls, a series of display screens reflecting different generated views of the Reaper that did not exist. One screen displaying the Normandy in orbit. There was no command central to a Reaper. There was a shielded location for the Reaper consciousness. Thought was the command method, direct interface. At the moment that was done through relay method, Leviathan gave information directly to Rin, or Rin relayed information to the Reaper consciousness through Leviathan, by thought. Fortunately, the Leviathan were patient. They accommodated the fact that his platform was deteriorating. He needed to accomplish the goal of placating the Normandy, placating her. For creatures that worked on the level of eons, Rin securing a few hours of sleep to maintain optimal function was not a concern. Enhancements and alternatives to rest as a biological recuperation method were possible, but that would become more clear as part of the process of him interfacing with the Reaper and learning what was possible. For now, that process would exhaust him. They would begin that after he had obtained sufficient rest and infrastructure for his control of Shepard. He was granted autonomy over his mental connection to Leviathan, asked to optimize his strength, and they would begin again at his schedule. In the meantime, he was free to accomplish his goals and maintenance tasks with their assistance as needed. If he had had time, he would have prayed to the darkness, but he did not, so he merely relayed his thanks and focused on his priorities. He did pray to her in his way, indulging in the risk of losing himself in her, indulging in the potential of what he could have with her, regardless of her knowledge of it. He could not permit her whole to think. She had developed many paths to escape while on the estate. She would again here, under new circumstances. On the estate, he had had the time to ask her what her plans were and then guide her to forget and visit that path no more. Here she had all the paths available, plus new spontaneous inspirations of the sort that terrified him. She must remain under. He sat on the control chair, his new throne, retrieved her bound and sleeping form and carried her to it, woke her with his mouth and his hands, his voice. There was always a twilight to her, where resistance and indifference warmed to interest and then fervor, and he savored those moments each time. He had to be exquisitely careful with his words, with her names, with his names. He tested what he already hoped was true, hoped would hold. She was still bound by venom. He looked in her eyes, and ensured she looked in his, told her, Lal Shepard. Your name is Lal Shepard. You do not remember Cara Fanning. You do not remember Dralafa. My name is Varen Celetis. You do not remember Thane Krios. You do not remember Kegurin Itran. Your name is Lal Shepard, and Varen Celetis is at your side. Your Rin. You know he belongs to you. You know he has followed you. He has watched over you while you recuperated from decompression sickness. You trust him with your life, with your thoughts. You hope to trust him with your heart, with your body. You will focus on these known facts. It is understandable that the past is distant and unclear. At the moment you do not remember Leviathan. You know you are on a reaper with your Rin, who belongs to you and will follow you, protect you. This is your moment, Lal, a moment that brings you joy and hope. You are on board and potentially in command of a reaper. You do not yet know what that means or how to do it, but you know you will. Controls of the reaper itself must be translated. You do not yet know the language you must speak to control it, but you know you will learn. You will find all the necessary keys to unlock what you need. Be joyous, Lal. Be Shepard. Let your crew know that you are triumphant, that you are safe, that you will not transmit any information to avoid having other Reapers pick up on the signal. Only short progress reports, Lal, for security's sake. Hope in your eyes, inspiration in your voice. Be Shepard for them, for me. Your Rin needs your inspiration. The galaxy needs you to save them, and you know you will. Show me what you will say to them. She did, and she asked questions he had not addressed, things she wished to say to reassure her crew. We have food, we have shelter, we have water, we will be fine. She would record and send heavily encrypted progress reports every 8 hours, and not 4 from this point on, to permit sleep without interruption. The Normandy should remain in geosynchronous orbit. All transmissions were the highest of classification, secrecy, and encryption. She would inform the Council separately. Do not transmit any information about location or disposition. She would use Spectre Code authorization to inform the Council. When the final version was recorded, she was bright, enthusiastic, slightly dazed at her luck. She conveyed all information as asked. At the end, her laugh, her Shepard smile, and a promise. We're going to win. He sent the final encrypted recording, and she smiled at him. How was that? He crossed to her and said, Perfect, as always, Lyria. Because she was Lao Shepard, and she knew her Rin belonged to her, had led her out of the dark, and followed her into the darkness, she impulsively reached for him. She held his face between her hands and smiled, then said, You look tired, Rin. Thank you for everything. Thank you for watching over me. You should get some rest. 8 hours until the next report. So much to learn, so much to do. He closed his eyes and said, As you wish, Lyria. He would create a dream around this moment, but now must face reality, exhaustion, creeping in on the edges of his vision, making him think that it would serve the greater purpose to lift her into his lap and lose himself in her body, sleep, and never wake. He must sleep, judgment beginning to fracture along lines of immediate desire and need. Sleep, her body, her eyes, her voice. With great effort he pulled from her embrace as she watched curiously, receptive. He retrieved the cloth and the cords from behind the camera range and asked her to stand, which she did. He kissed her and told her she was nameless, adored, and she must forget. He turned her small body, regret but determination in the binding of her unquestioning and unnamed hands. He knelt at her feet and bound them as well, care taken as always to deliver no injury. The room was huge, not far to move to allow the creation of a bed. He gained a renewed nosebleed, achieving something utilitarian, his lack of mental clarity forcing him to create something simple. No blankets or sheets, no cloth, simply a platform with something softer than floor. He knew all his risks, the time, and the fact that he should not indulge in her body, but the idea of sleeping without taking refuge in her seemed as improbable as opening the bay doors into the void and being crushed. He was denied her hands, having tied them already, and he mourned the loss on his skin, hoping her nails would grow. He could paint them, and with the colors he set on her she could find her new furrows. She was nameless and panting, the only question she had, the gentle strain against her bonds, the twisting of her hands and feet. He placed her on the bed on her back and followed her down. She was dressed as Lal, and he had only limited access to her body, her rough shirt rucked up along the forearm of his seeking hand. His mouth was on hers, his hand finding her breast, his other hand behind her head. She was held in place. Exactly her place. He held his place, tired and tenuous but hungry for her. Faint patches of biotics flared over his skin, and she groaned against his mouth, mindless and nameless, her hips angled up because she moved her bound hands into fists under her hips to lift herself to him. He counted desires for all her skin to be open to him, to guide her hands to free his cock and stroke with her fingertips, for nails to dig along his skin, to have his Dralafa again. This woman was his only in patches and pieces. They were not enough, but he was starved for her. He made the most of her being bound, his mouth on hers and his hand moving from her breast down to her fist-bound, tilted hips, holding his body of hers to spare her his weight. Where their bodies contacted, he lavished venom and strokes in and on her. Her mouth was open to his, her teeth on his lips, his seeking hand restricted by the harsh binding of cloth, but he found her, always found her, in her place, his place. She was wet and aching, whimpering against his mouth as he shifted his hand to her, thumb finding her clit, and his fused finger found his path. He pulled his mouth back until her whimpers were the only slightly felt vibrations, speaking to her the only truths he cared about. I want you. Always. Do you want me? Her tongue moved along his lips to lick venom from him, her hips arching into his hand, finding the rhythm that was hers, slowing time, as exhaustion did not give way, but the surge of biotics, desire, and her breath, her wet body seeking his palm on her upthrust was all that mattered. She said, yes. Her skin flushed and lit in blue, purple, where those patches met. Come for me. Come to me, whoever I am, whatever I ask. Her lip was between her teeth, and her yes, a weak but fervent thing, her neck thrashing against his palm. He lit his palm along her neck with warmth in blue, the same between her thighs, his body on hers finding her rhythm, his mouth on hers until she bit at his lip. The skin of their abdomens was the only skin free to touch, as she lifted again to roll against him, one of her thighs trapped between his cock riding there. Soon, and someday, and always, nothing between us. No bonds, your hands free to roam my skin, to mark me as yours. Her answer was not yes, but a weak laugh against his mouth, and he knew that laugh. It called a smile to his lips as his fingers beckoned, teased, slowed, and then pressed into her, around, as he said, I believe that is a vote for bonds. As you wish. Her answer was the surge up against him, straining, the rush of wet heat as her body clenched and shook around him, her teeth on his lower lip against her mouth. She had caught his breath and lost hers, strangled, keening from her throat, with him able to taste the sound on her lips, feel the rhythm on his fingers, and the palms of his hands pressed to her heaving body. With her laugh in mind and a remembered talk of storms and love, of physically expressed helplessness, he could not doubt. Too many times he had held her down, and she had demanded he do it. He shifted off her body, dragged her over to the edge with him, and flipped her over, bound feet on the floor, and ass in the air as she had been the first time, when she'd been too afraid to resist, intimidated and trained into obedience. Now her body remembered different things. His hands sliding down her hips and moving cloth aside, slick tip of his cock teasing at her ass while she trembled, her legs straight and without balance because her feet were bound. He anchored her bound hands behind her back, twisted the bonds in one of his hands and pulled her shoulders back taut, held her feet trapped between his and rocked his body against her, along her ass, but not inside. His hand played at the flesh of her ass, his thumb opening her to him with her answer, a whining sound of need and straining back against him. He twisted his fingers tightly in the bonds of her hands and pulled back as he worked inside her, and her body remembered always how to take him, transform him, blinding, tight fireworks along his nerves, his biotics arcing to kiss her skin, and red flush along her ass and lower back. She braced her legs against his, worked her hips back against his in a way he assisted with the twist and pull back of her arms, her eyes tightly closed, and bliss on her face. She had his rhythm, had him at her mercy, the tensing and rocking of her hips on his cock more than he could desire, his hand finding her clit again, sensitized and twitching until he found and she felt the jolts of pleasure arcing through her, the muscles of her back hardening and lengthening on either side of her spine under his grip. Her thighs tensed and shook between his as he built her back into coming for him, whatever she asked. Her body rocked with the pull of his hand on her bonds until her shoulders were as far back as they could go, her breasts and face pressed into the bed with the insistence of her hips and his hand defining where their bodies met and moved. He prayed to her, the trance of waiting for her to release him, waiting as tremors and trembles, whines and moans drew her and him in tight and slick, dizziness making him lean into her, pushing her back down further, drive into her deeper and pull her back against him until she screamed, the shock wave of her body tightening around him in chaotic and repeating shudders. He released the pull on her hands, leaned in and down with his hands sliding under her shoulders to clasp her to him as he came, her hips straining against his and his against hers, unable to get close enough, frantic, his teeth at the skin exposed between her neck and shoulders. He groaned with a sudden blaze of blue and surge inside her, combined tremors wet down their pressed-together thighs. He breathed her in, both panting, out of sync, harsh breaths causing more sensation to rock through him. He kissed the back of her neck. He is yours. She laughed again, the same laugh when he told her she could look forward to her hands being free, as though he should know the answer and not need to ask or say anything so obvious or foolish. And so he did. He was barely able to stand, realized he was about to lose consciousness, reluctantly detaching from the bliss of her body and the inevitable loss of his mind. He wished to curl up beside her as he so often had. His rightful place, chest to her back, hands in her hair and on her hip. Later. He set an alarm for 4 hours. He had nothing to secure her to, belatedly coming to this realization that she would not sleep the entire time, would not be envenomed. If he was to be a dead man, it was worth it. That did not mean he should court death as he courted her with so much fervor. He pulled from her further, righted her clothing and his, stood her up, turned her and kissed her, hands in her hair. He was tired, but not yet without resources. He tipped her chin up and looked into her eyes, asked her, "With what is available here in the room, how do I secure your immobility and comfort for 4 hours without harming you or permitting you to escape? Preferably on the bed with me." She closed her eyes and considered, then asked, "Do you have medications that would work for me on your Omnitool?" "I do." "Got any narrated?" "Yes." "Exactly 15 milligrams. I'll be out for 5 hours. You're a light sleeper. If you're concerned, I'll get away from you. Lash me to you with your shirt. Put your arms through mine. Wrap your thighs around mine. You'll wake if I try to move." He tilted his head. "And if you attempt to break my nose with the back of your skull or your forehead?" She tilted her head back. "Why would I do that?" "You have your moods. You worry too much. That is, under the circumstances, impossible." He gave her 15 milligrams of narrated and asked her to lie down on the bed. She did so obediently. The bed together was not an option given her adaptability. Unfortunately, he could not impress upon her how vicious she was, and he could not explain to her at the moment, or at any moment. There were insufficient words. He kissed her again, ruffled his hands through her hair, and told her, "Sleep, sleep comfortably. I will be here when you wake. If there is anything you need, you will have it then." "You're not staying?" "Alas, no. I have work to do, beautiful woman." "But what if I need you?" "Then you shall have me. In 4 hours." "Okay." He focused, bliss and exhaustion racing, buoyed by the sight of her. He ensured the room was sealed. All commands were keyed to only him, and she did not know how to give them, regardless of alarms, and narrated lasting 5 hours. He could not risk that time frame expiring without her being contained. With a rending, and what he feared was a physical and not psychic pop, more blood from the nose, he created a post secure to the floor, tested it with his body weight, tied her bound hands and feet to it with more created fiber, strong and tough, also tested for security. She would have a range if she woke, and he should be out of it, the last shreds of consciousness fading as he crawled out of what he considered to be that range, and then passed out. He roused after 4 hours to the alarm, still exhausted, physically and mentally worn, but not on the edge of losing consciousness. It appeared the narrated was still working. She had not moved. He checked to ensure she was breathing and comfortable, her circulation intact. Having an hour was a luxury in context. There were things he must create, amenities and partitions, workspace, theater space, living space. He was able to get help from the internal systems, able to summon food and water, rudimentary but promising. In theory, if he were able to provide a description, and Omnitool analysis had that available for many things, it could be created. For now, basics. Food, water, clothing duplicating what they had from the shuttle. He began to study, to attempt to assimilate. Narrated had toxicities, and he could not keep her under constantly. He would need alternate solutions. He had raging headaches, but was assured he would not experience permanent damage. His mind was adaptive and capable. The Leviathan were hopeful he could obtain rudimentary and ultimately independent control of navigation and manifestation, if not complicated synthesis. The Drell mind was more orderly than human. If hosts were to be procured, Drellhos would be superior to human. Obviously. He fed her. He bathed her. A few cycles of learn, stage, report, and venom, feed, bathe, bind. She sent a report to Garrus directly, encrypted and recorded. One of the drawbacks to the circumstances was that Shepard could refuse to answer Garrus Vakarian's personal correspondence, but Varin Celitis, with no job inside the Reaper and no place in the chain of command except below everyone, did not have that luxury. All requests were filed through his Omnitool. A direct request to confer came in from Vakarian, and Varin Celitis would have no reason not to take it. Vakarian's state of mind at the moment was in question. It appeared that T'Soni and Orveston were keeping Vakarian's more dangerous impulses in check. If Vakarian was telling them the truth, his solution was to ask Cara politely for an explanation and to obtain a blood sample. Cara was now problematic, but by the time Vakarian was able to see her in person, if Rin decided that was possible or necessary, that would no longer be a concern. The blood sample would be granted, of course, with Celitis' compliments and understanding of the necessity without grudge. Heroic. The DNA on the earrings was Krios', as Vakarian astutely intuited, exclusionary, and theater. Something to waste their time. Cara had warned him, and it was true. Vakarian had a talent for truth, and for finding it, he knew Cara, cared for her, loved her, and recognized the hallmarks of her protection. It was, as was true of both the bonded, admirable and disappointing. She had chosen her bondmate well, and that was galling. Vakarian's face was impassive and supportive, giving no signs of his suspicion. Just checking in. Wanted to know if there's anything I can do to help. Thank you, sir, for your concern. Can I talk to her? She was currently fading from venom influence, a few hours bound and helpless, while Rin was fully conscious and able to watch her. He did not wish to damage her mind through exposure to constant drug influence. More specifically, he did not want her addicted to anything but him. He could not always afford to envenom her without becoming very distracted. Rin answered, She is not here at the moment. She has not informed me a great deal of her actions. She is studying and muttering. I am afraid I do not understand her often. She is learning to speak a new language, new code, and her ability outstrips my comprehension. I have faith that wherever she is at the moment, it is of optimal importance. I will ask her to contact you. Vakarian grinned. Good luck with that. How is she? Is she sleeping at all? Rin hesitated and said with intimidated uncertainty. I have asked her to sleep. She does not often agree with me. She does eat. There is sufficient food and water stockpiled. I attempt to set a good example with sleeping, but in point of fact, sir, I am useless here. She is not. I also am aware that offering the same advice to her twice is not welcome. Rin recalled her body over his, bound and bent, her lip between her teeth and her head thrown back, and said, She is most enthusiastic, and I find that encouraging. She believes we will win, sir, and I believe her. Vakarian laughed. That's all good news. I guess she slept enough when she was dead. Thank you for taking care of her. If I have any influence at all, you are welcome. If she ever lets you out of there, let me buy you a drink on the Citadel if you make it back this way. Thank you, sir. I look forward to the opportunity. As he continued to work on interface nuances and possibilities, he was able to check on her. He faced her, but did lose access to his vision at times as he learned the internal structure of interface, his own vision replaced by perspective of what he was attempting to synthesize or comprehend. His only hint of something amiss was two muffled thumps, spaced apart. The first was directional toward her, but it might have been her testing the strength of her bonds, perhaps a yank and a rebound. The second made him suspicious enough to investigate. She was on the bed, seemingly quiescent. His suspicion of her was approaching 100% capacity, so if he were to approach her and have her look exactly as she always did, human, small, and bound, he believed her to be supernaturally capable and free. Which was not far from the truth. It might have worked. It should have worked. She was bound and on her side, as always, hands and feet tethered. She watched him as he approached, and, as always, something Cara in her eyes. The woman did not know how to be blank. He did not approach, but asked her, "What have you done, Cara?" She smiled at him, not her deadly smile, but a lulling smile. That on its own was enough to be suspicious, along with her eyes and the sound. "I'm tied here. What exactly do you think I could do?" That is the question, isn't it? The eternal question. One he was going to have to ask himself forever unless he found a way. He had to analyze, be careful, test her. He absolutely should not approach her at this moment. He would be dead. Some anticipation in her limbs. Something was wrong. Something right for her. Something wrong for him. It was the necessity and limitations of her plan that gave her away, something off for her. As he circled around her, she turned to face him. Something she rarely did. She was a woman of eye contact, blessedly. Her eyes were on his face, but not meeting his, and she was straining for something. He moved at a distance to examine her bonds, which were at her back. As he moved, she shifted to her back, watching his face. Not just his face, watching his lips. His lips curved in appreciation. It was perhaps something she had not discovered before, something he had not asked her to forget, because on Beckenstein it would not have benefited her. Something elegant. Something Cara. She was so close to his death. It trembled under her skin, in the eyes following his lips, because he had no idea. An hour and a half until her next check-in, and he had no idea. Follow the evidence. His lips. Why would she follow his lips? Of course she wanted his lips, but at the moment she saw them dead, not on her body. She saw him dead. How? It is a glorious thing that in a locked room, aided by two gods, I am terrified of you as you lay bound and trembling in all the wrong ways. However, that will not help me avoid what you believe will happen. What will happen? Am I to untie you? Investigate? Are you untied? Have you decided Vicarian's death is worth it? Do you finally know he would prefer to be dead than held hostage to you as long as I wish it? Vicarian. Lips. Evidence. He considered, and then asked in a Palaveni language, one he had forbidden her to learn, one she had not had time to learn since. What is it you have done, Venri? She did not give anything away to her credit. Beautiful liar she was. She did not draw her brows and did not panic, but she also could not answer the question. I think you're getting very paranoid, said Nar. It's okay, if you keep it up. He asked again in Palaveni. You can read my lips if I speak Drell, but not now the language you do not speak. You cannot hear me, can you, Venri? If you can, and I am wrong, and you can hear, tell me the name of the man you love who speaks this language. Venri. Palaveni for chosen purpose. A word for a bondmate. I wondered if Vakarian had ever called her that. She stayed on her back, eyes hungrily on his lips, but she did not speak Palaveni, could not read him, could not answer. It was very simple. If she could follow his commands without hearing his voice, he had no hypnotic sway over her at all. She would be nameless under venom, then choose her own name, with him lulled into believing she was obedient. His words, her words, would be meaningless. It's about time for me to check in, isn't it? I wonder what I'll say. She had not untied herself. She was still bound. She could not hear him, and her words were smoke to obscure his vision. He understood smoke. He could not compel her to tell him anything. He approached the post, took the binding cords and pulled until she was dragged toward him. She was still effectively bound. She had not escaped that. Why she had turned to her back was obvious. Blood down the back of her shirt, 2 long trails on either side of her back, unseen, because he always faced her. If he had not trained to be a doctor, he would not understand the mechanics of the human ear, but he had studied them when the risks of the ultrasound meant damage to them. He would ask her, but she would not answer. Not now. She had slammed her ears one by one into the hard surface of the platform until her eardrums ruptured, stayed silent, held her shoulders to her ears one by one, let the blood drain down her back, and waited in excruciating pain until he came for her. He could give her all the venom he wished, but none of his commands would have taken hold, and she would have a way to kill him. She would play him, lull him because he taught her exactly how. She would take his Omni tool, find every program he had on it, make sure to circumvent any contracts. The fact that she was willing to risk it meant he had no leverage over her any longer. She was at war. He was always 7 seconds from death in any direction. She was useless to him at the moment, severed and staring at him, not with hate, but with her counted desires of her own, all of them, at the moment, involving his death. He checked her bindings, intact, and once again, not the point. She was not a resource. The full implication of how close she had come, how simple it was, and the fact that he had always counted on having his voice, but had not anticipated what it would mean for her to not have her ears. She could repeat this at any point in her existence, rendering herself potentially immune to him, and he would never know the difference. He was angry at himself, at her, at the setback and the implications of losing her as an asset. He held her chin in his hand and forced her eyes to his, then touched his lips for her to look there. He spoke in clear and slow Drell. There are times, Tralafa, when the burden of your company is not worth the burden of your upkeep." He was furious, considered snapping her neck and having done with the entire charade of Shepard, an end to her, like an end to her hearing. He could, in this moment, and his hand itched to do it, to reach lower than her chin to her throat and take all his depths from her eyes and add her own. Instead, he watched her eyes. He considered what to do with her as a liability only. Time passed as she counted his potential deaths, and he counted the potential use of her life against all evidence to the contrary. He embraced war and burdens. His unstable fury sampled and lifted into a brazier, something she could see. "As you wish. You are in luck. I am a doctor. I will restore your hearing. It will take some time. I am certain you are in pain in the meantime. I have work to do. I would prefer you were not in pain, but not at the moment. There is a price to damaging my property. You are my property. If you are willing to sacrifice Vicarian, then we shall do that. There is no need to maintain your link to the man any longer. Before long, Dralafa, you will tell me you love me, and beg to hear me say it in return." She understood, shifting comprehension in her eyes, that he was where she was. It did not change that all she saw in him was his death. It almost changed his judgment to allow the will of his twitching hand that wished to move lower and end the threat of her. But once again, he was not a merciful man. A quick end to her, if that's what she wished to provoke to no longer be an asset, was not something he would allow. She was his property, and he decided what became of her. If she was small, bound, and helpless, he would know better. If she sought death with everything she was, he would deny her that.